When immersed in a good book, a reader can become unknown to the real world. They are able to ignore cars passing by, pedestrians on the street, consumers at a coffee shop, or the noise of a neighbor cutting their lawn just outside. Just as the reader is blind to the world that surrounds them, no one else seems to notice this withdrawn, content reader. Yet the idea of losing oneself in a fantasy realm or dystopian future has not always been commonplace. Shh! Silent reading is the individual practice of reading to oneself without sounding words out loud. Sustained silent reading is often used in an educational setting to encourage students to read recreationally and for their own enjoyment. Historically, in manuscript culture, reading tended to be a social activity with one person reading to a group. There are a couple of factors that helped contribute to the shift from performance-based or group reading to silent reading. The invention of the printing press helped develop the idea of personal privacy that exists today. Eventually, the press was able to produce smaller books that were easier for transport, helping to set the stage for individual reading. The mass production of books increased the availability of purchase for anyone. Before the printing press, most monastic schools of the early Middle Ages had one monk read aloud while the others, without books, listened. In the 14th century, 80% of English adults couldn't even spell their names. When the printing press was first invented, only 30% of European adults were literate. The printing press was able to mass produce books in a short amount of time. This allowed for people of all social classes to obtain print copies of writing and increased literacy rates. By 1641, 200 years after the invention of the printing press, literacy rates in England grew from 30% to 47%. By 1800, literacy rates reached 62%. The increase in literacy rates allowed more people the ability to read on their own, and this encouraged silent reading. While the invention of the printing press helped accelerate the common practice of silent reading, history states that silent reading occurred well before Johann Gutenberg's invention in the 15th century. In his writing Confessions from the 4th century, St. Augustine wrote about how amazed he was how his mentor St. Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, read his manuscripts. He stated,
"When he was reading, his eyes ran over the page and his heart perceived the sense, but his voice and tongue were silent. He did not restrict access to anyone coming, nor was it customary even for a visitor to be announced. Very often when we were there, we saw him silently reading, and never otherwise."
In this statement, Augustine points out how rare of an activity this was.
"We wondered if he read silently, perhaps to protect himself in case he had a hearer interested and intent on the matter, to whom he might have to expound the text being read if it contained difficulties, or who might wish to debate some difficult questions. If his time were used up in that way, he would get through fewer books than he wished. Besides, the need to preserve his voice, which used easily to become hoarse, could have been a very fair reason for silent reading."
While St. Augustine is unfamiliar with the idea of reading silently, he does understand his mentor's motives for doing so. The transition in writing to having word separation also accounted for the shift to silent reading. As seen on the screen, ancient and medieval manuscripts looked like this, and it was far easier to read them aloud. Not having spaces, punctuation, or dissimilarity between upper and lowercase letters did not make it impossible to read. However, a majority of readers would need to sound the words out. Providing separation between words originally began as an aid to oral reading, but ironically enough became the catalyst to silent reading as an accidental byproduct. While separating words and transcribing, medieval scribes were able to work silently, unlike their predecessors, who were required to sound words out as they copied text. The shift in educational reform also encouraged the use of silent reading over oral practice. Universities in the Western world in the 12th century required increased reading speeds, comprehension, and absorption in order to grasp more sophisticated ideas. As early as the 7th century, Isidore of Seville argued that reading in a loud voice interfered with comprehension, and he recommended that the tongue and lips be moved quietly. While the need for higher comprehension levels sparked a movement to silent reading, oral tradition and lecture still played an important role in education. Alternatively, as the majority of the world was illiterate in the 12th century, this affected very few people at the time. Finally, in a modern large household, there are plenty of areas that are spacious enough to provide a reader isolation and quiet in order to concentrate effectively to read a passage from a book. The notion of privacy was not something that was commonly practiced in the ancient world. Finding an area within a household where it was quiet was no easy task. However, when a quiet area was found, silent reading helped to promote the creation of an interior identity and a framework for our modern consciousness and ideologies. Reading silently helped introduce an interior and private world in which a variety of thoughts could develop and spread. This in turn resulted in a new type of reader, one who had been psychologically emboldened because of the ability to read silently. This allowed individuals to have the power to oppose authority, especially within the church, and demand change, bringing about many political and cultural changes. While reading the previous quote, how did you read it? Was it read silently in your head, or was it read out loud while you sounded out the words? As readers, we have the ability to understand context and are able to transition between silent and oral reading when necessary. The ability to sit silently and read text is a skill that is deemed essential in our 21st century world. As a result of silent reading, individual reading has become much more personal. A reader is able to have a personal relationship with a book. Not only do readers have a relationship with the novel, but also the relationship between author and reader has shifted. Two of the most popular writing styles today, prose and narrative, are a result of the silent reader. Silent reading developed an interior conscience that helped foster the idea of self-identity, individuality, and privacy. This empowerment within the reader highlights the ability to think critically and interpret text as they see fit. This interpretation of text would bring about cultural changes that molded our world into what it is today. With the shift from oral reading to silent reading, the world was introduced to a more literate population. In 2008, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization reported that 98% of American adults could read and about 83% of adults worldwide were literate. These statistics prove how our modern world values reading, whether it is done silently or out loud for others to hear. Studies have shown that the benefits of literacy include better health, greater social equality, and increased economic prosperity. Silent reading is an activity that is encouraged in schools around the world. Whether it is reading a short story or novel or some notes off the board, every student reads silently multiple times throughout their instructional day. Effective silent reading can include steady improvement of reading skills, exploration of a wide variety of reading material, learning to read with a purpose, and confidence in dealing with all forms of reading, whether for school, business, or leisure. While a majority of the world is able to partake in reading, one can only hope that the increase in technology can continue to spread information and allow literacy rates to grow across the world so that everyone can partake in the task of silent reading.